Hey there. You're listening to True Story No Cap. Real stories, no exaggeration, no lies. Just the raw, unfiltered moments life throws our way. Relax, lean back, and let's get started. From her youngest years, Julia absorbed a truth. A woman is given either dazzling beauty or a sharp mind. The choice is hers. And little Julia, fully aware that she could choose, bet on intellect. Before her eyes stood a living example, her older sister, Alana. Her beauty drew universal admiration, hair the color of ripe wheat flowing like silk, eyes a deep green, like a mermaid from a fairy tale, and a figure, the ideal fashion designers dream of. Alana devoted herself to her appearance from an early age. She read a lot, but it was glossy magazines with tips on makeup, diets, and other attributes of attractiveness. And Alana's friends were similar, sweet, but in Julia's opinion, frivolous airheads. Their mother, bearing the burden of caring for two girls alone, placed all her hope on the elder. "Just marry well, Alana, and we'll live happily ever after." Julia, then still a tiny thing, a primary school student, sincerely couldn't understand. How could you shift the responsibility for your own fate and well-being onto another person's shoulders? Hadn't their mother, who herself had gone through the pain of disappointment, learned her lesson? One day, Julia asked her mother directly, "You married Dad for money too, right? And he left us, went to someone younger and prettier, and left nothing because her demands were greater. And now you're teaching Alana the same thing? So she'll end up like that too?" "Bite your tongue," their mother exclaimed, throwing up her hands. "Our Alana is completely different. First, she's young. Second, much prettier than me. And most importantly, she has me. I had to learn everything from my own mistakes. But I'll guide her, teach her. Everything will work out well for Alana. And for you too, if you listen to me." Julia just sighed heavily. Her mother was beautiful, kind, but incorrigibly frivolous. Both mother and Alana floated in clouds of illusion, dreaming of a fairy tale life and considering appearance the key to female success. Julia differed from her peers in her character. She was convinced, to achieve something, you must work hard. The options implied by her mother and sister, wealthy patrons, seemed shaky, unreliable, a mirage. Alana jokingly called her younger sister a bore. Their mother constantly tried to change Julia, to impose her vision of the world. At the same time, the parent sincerely believed she wished her daughter well. "I'm worried about your future. Why don't you understand? You've grown into such a beauty. You got the best from me and your father. When you finish school, we'll find you a wealthy groom. Just don't be so gloomy, men like cheerful and lively women." "No, thank you. After school, I'm going to study economics," Julia replied. "Do you know how tough the competition is there?" Alana interjected. "You either have to be a genius or have connections." "Yes," their mother echoed. "We can't afford commercial education, and you won't get in for free." But Julia, ignoring her relatives' arguments, pursued her goal. She pored over textbooks day and night, searched for extra lessons online, mostly free ones because her mother, who worked as a cashier at the local supermarket, didn't have money for her daughter's education. Her father was barely involved in their lives. He had a new family. Yes, he sent some meager alimony, but that was the extent of it. No communication, no support. Julia knew from childhood, don't count on him. Deep down, the girl dreamed of meeting her father just once. It seemed to her that perhaps her character came from him, as she wasn't at all like her mother or Alana, but he didn't seek meetings. And Julia? She didn't want to intrude. And besides, it was scary to face indifference or worse, dislike. Her father was a successful businessman, owning a chain of stores. He had prudently registered his property under his new wife's name so his former family wouldn't claim anything. It seemed petty and ugly. Julia should have resented her father, just like her mother and Alana. But Julia had another dream, to get an economics degree, start her own business, and one day meet her father on business, a joint project, a profitable contract. Let him see what his daughter achieved on her own, without his help. And then perhaps they would talk as equals. And Julia got her wish. She was accepted on a state-funded place at that very economics faculty. Her joy was boundless. She screamed with delight in front of the monitor, jumping up and down. "Are you crazy?" Alana looked into the room, holding little Ian. She had recently become a mother, giving birth to a son by a wealthy man. He paid alimony but didn't want to interact with Alana or their son. And of course, the alimony was meager, a standard scheme for concealing income. Alana repeated her mother's fate, but in an even sadder version. However, she didn't give up, continuing to dream of a prince who would solve all her problems. Their mother supported Alana in everything, adored her grandson. It was natural. Julia also enjoyed playing with the baby when she found the time, but the girl saw, you can make as many plans as you want, but if they are based on hoping for someone else, it's fragile and unreliable. It was time to choose a different path. But no, Alana still spent hours on dating sites, hunting for new prey. I got in. Julia explained the reason for her jubilation to her sister. Wow, cool. So you'll move out? Go to the city for university? Julia and her family lived in a city, but a very small one, far from the regional center. Gray 3-story buildings, streets of dilapidated barracks, a huge private sector. Essentially, a large village. Therefore, Orakhovsk, the regional capital where Julia's university was located, was simply called the city by everyone. Their mother was also happy to hear about her younger daughter's acceptance. She, it turned out, hadn't even hoped. She thought, let the younger one be stubborn, and then, after listening to experienced relatives, she'd understand. She needed to find a rich and reliable man. And then this turn of events. You got in. Good girl, daughter. Their mother hugged Julia. I'll help however I can. I'm sorry, I won't be able to send much money, but I'll find enough for housing and food. And you need to dress nicely in the big city. There are more chances to meet a decent person there. Mom, there you go again. Julia smiled. She was touched that her mother supported her and offered help. Julia knew this money didn't come easily to her mother, but she was willing to help her student daughter. It was priceless. Julia's new life began. She was given a place in the student dormitory, though not a private one. She had to share a room with 2 girls. But her roommates turned out to be pleasant. Both studied pedagogy. Both, like Julia, were focused on their studies and future. They had a lot in common. Julia became friends with one of them, Katie. Their friendship lasted even after they graduated and moved into rented apartments. Julia liked her studies. In her first year, she realized she had chosen the right path. Economics came easily, lectures were engaging, and tests and projects seemed like a trifle. Julia even started earning money, finding that people were willing to pay significant amounts, by student standards, for commissioned essays and projects. The girl had to study and work a lot. There was no time at all for student parties, clubs, and other entertainment. Sometimes, of course, she wanted to relax, but Julia understood. Every minute counted, her time was too valuable, and money was scarce. Her mother sent a small sum, a significant portion of her salary, and Julia was very grateful to her. It wasn't much, but this help allowed her to stay afloat. Especially after the 3rd year, when the dormitory suddenly became paid. Before that, it was free. Julia economized on everything but didn't despair. She knew she was working towards her goal, and sooner or later, everything would be as she planned. But around New Year, an event occurred that turned her life upside down. It was the time of pre-session rush, when students try to clear all their debts. Julia was just preparing for an economics history test when her sister called. Alana's photo appeared on the screen, smiling, radiant. Julia immediately felt something was wrong. Alana wouldn't call at 1 a.m. just like that. It was Julia who was awake, studying. Her sister should be dreaming at that hour. Something's wrong with Mom. Alana's voice, ringing with hysteria, came through the receiver. Come here. What happened? Julia felt her hands and feet go cold, and a hollowness inside. Anxiety squeezed her heart with an icy hand. Bus. What? When? She's alive. It was impossible to get a coherent answer. Alana was sobbing, dropping only fragments of phrases, mostly moaning about her own fear and pain. The trouble, it seemed, had happened in the evening, but she was only informed now. Of course, there was no talk of any tests anymore. In the morning, Julia took the first bus home. At the bus station at such an early hour, she was almost the only one. She found her sister in a terrible state, disheveled, her face swollen from tears. In her arms, she held her youngest daughter, tiny Mila. Alana was already a mother of 3. Ian, then 2 girls born a year apart, Christina and Mila. None of the fathers participated in their upbringing. Princes from wealthy families paid off with meager alimony, seeing Alana only as fleeting entertainment. She had, after all, repeated her mother's fate in an even worse version, but she didn't give up, continuing to dream of a savior. What about me? What about the children? If something happens to her, how will I manage with them alone? Alana looked at Julia with bewildered eyes as if expecting a solution. Julia felt like hitting her at that moment. Something unknown was happening with their mother, and she was only thinking of herself. How did it happen? At home, they said Mom was crossing the road in the wrong place. She ran right in front of the bus. The driver couldn't do anything. He's in shock himself, in the hospital with a heart attack. While they were figuring everything out, they called me late at night. I immediately called you. So Mom is alive? Julia clarified. That was the main thing. In the hospital in Morozovskaya? Julia rushed out of the house, calling a taxi as she went. She had to get there as soon as possible to understand what was happening with the person closest to her. At the hospital, a terrible piece of news awaited her. Her mother was gone. She had passed away very recently, while Julia was rushing to the clinic. It happened in the intensive care unit. The doctors said the injuries were too severe, and Julia wouldn't have been able to say goodbye anyway. Her mother was in a coma, and still, the girl blamed herself for not holding her mother's hand in her final moments. Julia was signing some papers when a sobbing Alana called. Someone she knew had brought her to the hospital. It was a difficult time, the funeral trying to bring her sister back to her senses who, despite everything, had to take care of the little ones, and the gradual realization of the terrible loss. The person closest to her was no longer there, simply gone. Her father didn't show up at the funeral, although he couldn't have been unaware of what happened. He didn't even call his daughters, didn't ask if they needed help. Perhaps he considered them adults. Both were over 18. Legally, he wasn't indebted. He paid alimony until they came of age. There was nothing more to expect. It was then that Julia understood she wouldn't seek meetings with this man. Even they, Alana, her mother, and herself, weren't needed by him. Nor did they need him. There was no resentment. Julia simply realized her father was a complete stranger to her. Perhaps they were somewhat alike, but he, a stranger, just a stranger. And that said it all. But Alana, she was family, and she needed support. Her sister sobbed for several days, and Julia didn't stop her. Let her cry out her grief. While Alana was dealing with her pain, Julia helped with her nephews and nieces. Even in that terrible situation, the little ones made her smile. It was impossible to look indifferently at their games, to listen to their babbling. Her nephews and nieces showed Julia, life goes on. Julia couldn't stay with her sister for long. The winter session was approaching, and Alana had recovered a bit, even started monitoring dating sites again. Now she wanted even more to find a mature, supportive man. Her mother was no longer there. Julia, despite everything, passed her session with excellent grades. This allowed her to stay in the dormitory, but the dormitory had become paid, and she also needed to eat, dress, and travel. Julia tried to combine studying and working at a cafeteria. It turned out to be impossible. Absences and debts quickly accumulated. In the end, she didn't even get permission for the next session. Expulsion was looming. Julia tried to negotiate with her professors, asked for a chance, promised to pass everything, but it didn't work out. The only way out was to transfer to distance learning. But there were no state-funded places, and commercial education cost exorbitant money. The solution was offered by the rector. He called Julia to his office and suggested the only option in his opinion. I know your situation. The man, who reminded Julia of Friar Tuck, good-natured, plump, and short, began the conversation paternally. You are a diligent, promising student. We want to help such students. I will close your session even if with average grades, and you take an academic leave for a year. I will help with the paperwork. You are determined. You will re-enroll in a year, and I will help again with all the nuances. How does that sound? Julia thought about it. She didn't want to interrupt her studies, but what other options were there? The session was failed, expulsion. Where would she go? Home, to her parents' apartment? A new boyfriend of Alana's, a young and seemingly decent guy named Stephen, already lived there. Unlike the previous ones, he wasn't rich. He worked in construction, slaving away from dawn till dusk. Alana loved him, and he accepted the children. Perhaps they would become a family. Julia was now superfluous there, and she didn't want to live with her sister herself. No, she loved her. She was the only family she had left. But Julia was used to peace, solitude, freedom, and there was a large family there. It wouldn't work. And most importantly, she didn't want to leave Orakovsk. It was a big city, beautiful, interesting. More prospects. The village where she spent her childhood was associated with longing. She didn't want to go back there. I think I'll take your offer, Julia smiled at the rector. That's a good girl, the man beamed. You're doing great. Everything will work out. Just don't forget to save up for your studies. Be sure to come back in a year. We'll be waiting. Agreed? Agreed. Thanking the rector, Julia started looking for a job that same evening. She urgently needed money to survive. Food, housing, the strongest motivation. It turned out that finding something in her field without a diploma was unrealistic. Rejection everywhere. Employers didn't even consider her. Julia understood she could prove herself, but she didn't even get to the interview stage. After a couple of days of fruitless searching, she realized it was time to let go of her dream of economics. Or rather, postpone it. And for now, find anything. When her expectations lowered, things started moving. There were many vacancies for Julia: waitress, cleaner, salesperson. The salaries, however, were meager. It would be enough to live on if she economized. But Julia needed to save up for a year of study. With such wages, it was impossible. And yet, she needed a job urgently. She chose a job as a waitress in a bar in the city center. There were enough advantages. They paid extra for night shifts. Tips were a great help, sometimes generous. And shift work allowed her to write commission projects and tests. An extra penny and her brain wasn't idle. Pure benefits. She even liked working at the bar. The team was friendly, the management was loyal, the clientele was decent. It was a rock bar. The owners valued their reputation. They maintained the atmosphere. Undesirable visitors were politely escorted out. And also, every evening, musicians gathered there, local and visiting. Live music. It was wonderful. Julia enjoyed listening, singing along. It was encouraged. Going to work like a holiday, Julia finally understood the meaning of that phrase at the bar. Of course, you couldn't save much on a waitress's salary. Julia was looking for a better-paying job, but she knew, even when she quit, she would come back here to visit, just to be in this warm atmosphere. The rock bar and new friends helped Julia get through her grief. The longing for her mother didn't disappear, but the girl was able to return to life and believe that there was much good ahead. It was at the rock bar that Julia met Simon. One day, the host introduced a new band. Simon was the bassist, but not only that. The idea to create the band belonged to him. He wrote songs and music, modest, keeping to the shadows but constantly observing. The band, the audience. Simon was the brains of the team, although the vocalist drew attention on stage. It was clear immediately. For some reason, Julia immediately noticed him, felt a pull. She didn't recognize herself. Julia understood that now was not the time for romance. She was focused on her studies, career, and recovery. She couldn't be scattered, distracted. And yet, Simon didn't joke or flirt with the waitresses. He was focused on his work. Perhaps that's what won her over. Simon was very much like her. Simon started appearing at the bar often, sometimes with the band, sometimes just to relax. Soon they got acquainted. But he remained distant, didn't show affection. Although sometimes Julia caught his gaze on her, he immediately looked away. Julia wanted him to notice her, to compliment her like other patrons, and then she would let him know she was interested. One day, a girl appeared in Simon's company. No, there had been girls before, friends, band members. But this one, there was clearly something more between her and Simon. They didn't kiss, didn't hug, but they exchanged tender glances, smiled warmly, and one day she rested her head on his shoulder, and Simon, usually cold, even stern, stroked her hair with a natural, very gentle gesture, like a kitten. An unpleasant feeling stirred in Julia's chest. She immediately recognized it: jealousy. With surprising meticulousness, Julia began to look for flaws in her rival. Too thin, scrawny, not pretty, a long nose, thin hair. How could this madam compare to her, Julia? It seemed that for the first time in her life, Julia felt smug about her appearance. Nature had endowed her, like Alana, with beauty. She heard compliments about her figure, tall, slender, long-legged. Friends advised her to try a modeling agency, but that job wasn't to her liking. She didn't know how to showcase herself, considered it humiliating. Despite Julia's impressive qualities, her rival was such a blue stocking. There was nothing outstanding about Simon's companion. Nevertheless, he clearly felt tender feelings for her. Her presence made him happy. Julia watched carefully. It was true. He loved her. It was painful. Thanks to the girl who clung to Simon like that, Julia decided. She decided on something she had previously considered unacceptable. Her shift was ending, but she stayed to help a friend. Saturday. Julia waited for the moment. She had a drink for courage to feel more confident. Simon stood up and headed for the exit. Someone had called him. The music was blaring in the bar. It was impossible to talk. Everyone went out, onto the street, onto the porch, to the smoking area. Simon chose the street. Julia followed him like a shadow. Now or never. The unpleasant girl stayed at the table, chatting cheerfully with his friends. They probably had a long, serious relationship. And yet, Julia would try. Otherwise, she would regret not even trying. Simon stepped onto the porch. He paced the small area in front of the bar, patiently explaining something. Julia watched through the window. Simon wasn't smiling, wasn't joking. The conversation was serious. It didn't matter. Julia would approach him anyway. As soon as Simon finished his call and was about to go back inside, Julia came out to meet him. Fortunately, they were alone on the porch. "Hi," Julia smiled. "Hi." Simon looked at her with interest. "We've already said hello, haven't we?" "Yes, we have," Julia nodded. I need to talk to you." Simon stopped, composed himself, showed he was ready to listen. He could have brushed her off, shown annoyance, but he looked at her with his dark, intelligent eyes and waited. I like you. I have for a long time." Julia decided to get straight to the point. I don't know how to explain it. I'm drawn to you like a magnet. It's never been like this before. I don't know what to do about it." Julia lowered her eyes. That was it. She had said it. What next? Simon was probably searching for words to politely refuse. Most likely. Julia suddenly felt unbearably ashamed. Why had she done that? How could she look him in the eye now? Julia. In the next moment, the girl felt a gentle touch, as if she were a fragile vessel. Julia. Her own name, spoken by Simon, sounded like beautiful music. Julia, I couldn't even imagine. Simon looked at her and smiled, and he smiled so rarely. His eyes, she saw, shone with sincere happiness. What was happening? Was he happy about her confession? Instead of words, Simon kissed Julia. Her head spun. He hugged her, held her, because her legs were giving way. He kissed her, stroked her back, her head, held her close tenderly. I've been watching you for a long time too, and I'm drawn to you just the same way. Then why? I didn't notice anything. I thought you didn't care. I didn't want to embarrass you. I was wrong, and I'm older. I thought you were attracted to other guys. Brutal, successful. With your looks, anything is possible. You're incredibly beautiful. You even inspired a song in me. I realized that Elven Princess is about you. No, Julia confessed. It's a very beautiful song. I like it. I didn't think that it was because of you. Well, yeah, only... And that girl? Who came with you? Are you together? Together? Simon chuckled. Together since my parents brought home a bundle with a pink ribbon from the hospital and said, "My sister." So she's your sister, Julia laughed, and I thought, that's why I decided to do it today. Sister, sister. Simon held Julia tighter, inhaling the scent of her hair. Just passing through the city. She's been married for a long time, lives far away. She missed her good-for-nothing brother. Julia and Simon started dating. It turned out he had long been attracted to the beautiful waitress. Why hadn't he made a move? He was going to, but later, when he had more money. He had a belief. Girls aren't interested in failures. He had a lot going on with the band. But the guys were starting to earn money, the prospects were good, and, strangely for a rock musician, Simon was shy with girls. He had many female friends, but Julia, she evoked special feelings. This made him, accustomed to performing in front of hundreds, feel timid. But Julia made the first move, dispelling his doubts. And now they were together. Simon suggested they move in. They chose Julia's apartment, convenient location, reasonable price, cozy room. It turned out that Simon moved in with her, but he immediately took over, paying the rent and minor repairs. And it also turned out that Simon was an excellent cook. A creative person created masterpieces, in the studio or in the kitchen. He was tender, sensitive, attentive, immersed in his creativity, but not forgetting his beloved. They talked a lot, went for walks. They discussed Simon's new songs. Sometimes Julia would suggest a phrase, and he would eagerly seize the idea. And then the girl was proud of herself. She participated in creating a hit. Julia was lost in her feelings. Before meeting Simon, she didn't know what love for a man was. She hadn't had time for it. Studies, trying to survive. It turned out to be pleasant when there was someone nearby who hugged you, was interested in your mood, looked at you with admiring eyes, like a princess, and to melt from the touch of warm hands, knowing that this tall man with black eyes was ready to do anything for you. Alana didn't approve of her sister's choice. As always, she judged by her own standards. He's poor. He doesn't have an apartment, no stable job, a musician, a rock band. So what? Who needs them? There are tons of these one-hit wonder bands. Success is unknown. You're wasting your potential with your looks. Okay, me. I have 3 kids. Who needs me? I settle for what I have. But you. However, Julia didn't expect understanding. They had always been different. But Julia didn't need understanding. She was happy, loved. A close, dear person had appeared in her life. Yes, he was going through a difficult period now, but Simon was trying, working towards his goal, working hard, looking for contacts, planning. Julia supported him, and he appreciated it, thanked fate for such a gift, for her. One day, Simon embarked on a risky venture. He invited a famous rock band to Orakovsk. His band was supposed to play the opening set. This was supposed to increase their popularity, and organizing concerts was a way to earn money. But something went wrong. Few people came. There was a big rock festival in a neighboring region. Simon found out late. The result, a big loss. The musicians' fees, rent, tickets, advertising, only half was recouped. The concert went well, but Simon incurred huge debts. How to cover them? It was hard for Julia to watch her beloved. He was bewildered, anxious. She wanted to help. Where would she get the money? Simon took out a loan, but it was a drop in the ocean. Friends helped, it eased the burden, but the debt remained substantial. And then, Julia offered help. She had savings for her studies. Not much, but still something. Besides, she did something she was against. She sold the gold jewelry from her mother. This money was enough to cover the debt. Where did you get this? Simon was surprised, seeing the stacks of bills. Well, a debt was unexpectedly repaid. Plus, the insurance finally paid out for Mom's case. Julia lied. She knew if she told the truth, he wouldn't take it. This way, it wasn't his last resort. Thank you. Simon hugged Julia tightly. I'll return everything, you'll see. We'll be famous soon. Simon paid off the debt, continued to develop the band. Julia slowly paid off the loan. Saving for her studies didn't work out. Her salary at the bar decreased. The bar was going through tough times. It was good that Simon bought groceries, paid for the apartment, took on the main part of the expenses. Simon's income came from rare corporate events and part-time gigs. It was unstable, but the stream didn't dry up. Sometimes nothing, sometimes a lot. Julia didn't worry too much, basking in Simon's attention, his love, his care, giving him tenderness, love, support. She tried not to think about the future. If she didn't re-enroll this year, she would next year. There was time. The main thing was that he, Simon, was by her side. Julia hadn't known before that she was capable of such feelings. And then Simon disappeared. He didn't run away. Nothing terrible happened. It started as a business trip. Simon grabbed Julia by the shoulders, shaking her slightly. His eyes were burning. Can you imagine? I was invited to the U.S. to write music for a band. They found me online. They liked it. Julia couldn't believe her ears. She knew that band, very popular, they toured the world. They noticed Simon. They were offering collaboration. Incredible. I'll have to leave for a while, Simon continued. Do you understand what this means? Julia nodded. She understood. Money, fame, opportunities for growth, connections. He would get what he hadn't dared to dream of. They would have to part for an indefinite time. Simon said clearly, I'll have to leave. I, not we. The preparations began. Simon had many things to sort out. Find a replacement in the band, get a passport, a visa, pack his things. In this hustle, he seemed to forget about Julia. Too engrossed in the changes, the prospects. The girl looked at him and understood. He would forget about her. There, in another country, overwhelmed by impressions, inspired by success. Perhaps he would find someone there. He held her so tenderly in the evenings, sincerely assuring her he would miss her. Time will fly by quickly. There's video calls, we'll stay in touch constantly. At least I'll finally earn money, I'll pay you back. I know how much you need that money. Maybe we'll buy an apartment. My band will take off. I'll gain invaluable experience. Everything will be fine. Simon sincerely believed it. Julia saw he wasn't lying. But something told her everything would change as soon as he was abroad. Simon just didn't realize it himself yet. And that's how it turned out. At first, Simon called every day, talked about the new place. Everything was exciting. Then he suddenly disappeared from the radar, just vanished. He didn't call himself, didn't answer Julia's calls. Long rings ended with a message that the subscriber was busy. Julia was initially worried, thought something terrible had happened, but soon she saw that band performing on a music channel. Simon was with them, changed, more mature, even more serious. So, he was fine. He just decided to start a new life, cut off old ties, forget about her. At first, the girl still hoped, waited for a call, an explanation, but Simon disappeared completely. Julia started watching the music channel every day. Sometimes she saw Simon. He wasn't in the spotlight, but he appeared in the frame, and often there was a girl next to him. The same one, either a makeup artist or a costume designer. Beautiful, striking. Apparently there was something between them. There had to be. Julia was desperately jealous. Of this girl, of other potential muses. It hurt her. It hurt more than ever before. It was upsetting. Scary. Scary to be alone again without support. An unpleasant mix of feelings. And there were other problems, pressing ones, financial. Julia was barely making ends meet, a tiny salary and a loan. Eventually the bar went bankrupt. It was bought out and turned into a hookah lounge. Julia was fired like everyone else. Another blow. That place held special memories. And now the bar was gone. The cozy bar with live music and a warm atmosphere. Simon would have understood, supported her. Everything was easier with him. But he was hundreds of miles away and, it seemed, had forgotten about her. Simon had no idea how desperate her situation was. He didn't know about the loan, thought Julia had helped him with an extra amount. Of course, he didn't guess about the firing. And if he had known, he didn't have time for Julia now. Julia had no time to dwell on resentments. She desperately needed a job, a well-paying one. She constantly monitored ads, looking for a way out of the financial hole. It was good that the landlord agreed to wait for the rent. But patience isn't limitless. In a little while, Julia would be asked to leave. An ad attracted her with the salary. A decent figure, it could solve her problems. But the job, it seemed unfamiliar. They needed a caregiver for a little girl. Unwell. The diagnosis wasn't named, but they made it clear. Round-the-clock care, nursing, medication on schedule, accompanying to procedures. Julia thought about it. She had experience caring for little ones. She liked playing with her nephews and nieces. She knew how to get along with children, but here, a sick child. Seriously ill, could she do it? It was worth a try. She called. A pleasant male voice. He asked questions, age, occupation, education, experience. They invited her for an interview. Julia was nervous. She really wanted the job. She needed it like air, a chance to climb out, to stay afloat. Where else could she find such a salary? She was worried. What if they didn't hire her? What then? Look for a waitressing job for pennies again? A taxi took her to a suburban cottage community, an elite area, beautiful houses behind fences. At the gate, she was met by a woman, the housekeeper, Mrs. Eleanor. She did everything: cleaning, cooking, laundry, because the employer, Mr. George, was always busy. Businessmen have little free time. Mr. George met her in the living room, a man in his 40s with intelligent, piercing blue eyes, perfect hair with graying temples, athletic build. He clearly took care of himself. Julia was initially intimidated. How to start the conversation? Next to him, she felt insignificant. "Good morning." Mr. George smiled warmly, and Julia's embarrassment disappeared. His smile was open, kind. He immediately seemed approachable. "Hello," Julia smiled. "I'm here about the ad." "Very good. I'll tell you right away. We need a caregiver for my daughter, Sophie. She's in a serious condition. Not everyone can handle it. Her health is monitored by doctors. They come every day. I could hire a nurse, but how to say it? There's already a lot of pain in her life, people in white coats. I'd like someone else to be with her. A young girl, like you. Cheerful, knows songs, fairy tales, able to cheer her up, inspire her, come up with activities, to brighten her leisure time." "And what's wrong with your little girl?" Julia couldn't help but ask. "Who knows?" Mr. George lowered his eyes. His gaze became heavy. "Sophie has been examined everywhere. No one can understand. Her body, it's like it's destroying itself. There are no signs of autoimmune aggression. Tests are constantly being taken. But she's fading, and nothing helps. Poor little thing. The doctors, they say they're doing what they can. You understand? They're not almighty. Sophie doesn't just need a nanny. There's Mrs. Eleanor for that. And not just a caregiver. Sophie is supervised by nurses. Sophie needs a friend. Someone capable of providing positive emotions. Doctors say it's important. Looking at you, it seems you are like that. Young, beautiful, cheerful. Your gaze is kind. You know how to empathize. That's good." Julia nodded. She already wanted to see Sophie. If the little girl needed positive emotions, she would give them to her. She would cheer the girl up, brighten her days, find a way to make her life more pleasant. "If you're ready to start right now," Mr. George continued, "let's begin. A trial period of 3 days. And after that, Sophie will decide. Your time will be paid for in any case. Agreed?" "Yes," Julia nodded. "Excellent," Mr. George beamed. "Mrs. Eleanor will introduce you to Sophie, and I must go. I have business." When the door closed behind Mr. George, Mrs. Eleanor, a middle-aged woman with a gentle gaze, asked, "Have you spent time with little ones before? Do you know what small children are like?" "I have nephews and nieces," Julia nodded. "Good." Mrs. Eleanor shook her head. "Only our Sophie. She's an unusual child. You probably understand yourself. Sophie barely gets up, she gets tired. It's hard to keep her interested, but we must. Distract her from the pain, from the suffering. And she needs to go for walks. At least an hour a day, the doctor said." "I understand. Well, let's go meet her." Julia followed Mrs. Eleanor upstairs to the second floor. She entered the children's room, a spacious princess room. A huge window, lots of light. Shelves with expensive toys, books. In the center, a mini playground. A slide, swings, a trampoline. Further on, a ball pit. Closer to the door, a bed. Huge, round, with a pink canopy. Julia looked around with curiosity. She had never seen such rooms. All for one child? Amidst the splendor, Julia didn't immediately notice the owner. The girl was lying in bed among soft toys. A cat named Batten, a white bear, a green crocodile. A thin, pale 7-year-old girl, transparent, almost blending with the bedding due to her unhealthy skin color. Huge blue eyes like her father's looked with curiosity. Sophie propped herself up on her elbows, albeit with difficulty, and asked Mrs. Eleanor, "Who is this? A new rehabilitation therapist?" The complex word rolled off her tongue easily, habitually, unnaturally. "No, sweetie, this is your new friend, Julia. You'll play together." "With dolls?" Sophie brightened slightly. "Whatever you want," Julia smiled. The girl evoked pity. I like playing with dolls. Okay, because Vera doesn't have time and Dad doesn't know how. Adults have a lot to do, Julia shrugged. That's why they're sometimes boring, Sophie suggested and smiled conspiratorially. Boring, Julia agreed. Sophie giggled quietly. I see you'll be fine, Mrs. Eleanor sighed with relief. Have fun, I'm going to make lunch. And, Sophie, remember the nurse is coming today? I remember, the girl frowned. Another IV? What can we do, dear? Mrs. Eleanor kissed the girl and left. Julia stayed with Sophie. Well, shall we play? Julia asked with a smile. There's too much to choose from. Better read, the girl requested. The short conversation had drained her strength. Sophie sank back onto the pillows, pulled up the blanket, although it was warm. Okay, Julia agreed. The child's weakness surprised her. 7-year-olds, energizers. Like Ian, her eldest nephew, Sophie's age, but you couldn't keep him still for 5 minutes, always climbing, inventing things. If he were in this room, he'd be on the trampoline or slide immediately. Alana called him a perpetual motion machine. Mila and Christina weren't far behind, but Sophie lay flat. What should I read? About princesses. The book is on the windowsill. Vera started it, but she didn't have time. You continue? A heavy, beautiful book with bright pictures. But the story? Silly, boring, predictable. Julia didn't like such books as a child. How about we make up a story about princesses ourselves? As Julia expected, a flicker of interest appeared in Sophie's tired eyes. How? She clarified. Simple. I start, you continue. The activity captivated Sophie. She inventively made up adventures, a racing car, being kidnapped by a dragon, being rescued by a prince. Her imagination flowed freely. She clearly lacked such interaction. Then Mrs. Eleanor came in. Seeing that Julia and Sophie had gotten along, she was pleased. She brought lunch, cream soup, vegetables. Sophie wrinkled her nose. I don't want it, she said, and I don't want to eat it all, especially not this. Mrs. Eleanor looked at Julia, clearly expecting help. Let me feed you, Julia said to Sophie. Every spoonful is a princess's adventure. I'll make them up as I go. Can you imagine how much I'll have to tell? What will run out first, the food or my imagination? The trick worked. The food ran out faster, but Sophie demanded more stories. Mrs. Eleanor threw up her hands in surprise, smiled, and left. The nurse came in. Sophie immediately grew somber. She was almost asleep, lunch, and the story had tired her, but it was time for procedures. IV? She asked the nurse hopelessly. The nurse nodded sympathetically. I'll do it quickly. Don't be scared. It won't hurt. You'll sleep afterward, and we'll have some tea. Mrs. Eleanor pulled Julia away. You're not needed here right now. The housekeeper led Julia to the spacious kitchen. Steaming cups of coffee and fragrant pie were waiting on the table. You and Sophie got along, the woman smiled. That's good. Sophie chased away the previous nanny, but she took to you right away. I called Mr. George, told him. He's very pleased. He ordered me to take good care of you. I'm happy too, Julia smiled. I just feel sorry for Sophie. My nephews and nieces are noisy, cheerful, but she just lies there and can't play. It's scary. What do the doctors say? Are there any chances? No predictions, Mrs. Eleanor shook her head. They can't make a diagnosis. They're treating the symptoms. After the IV, Sophie will feel a bit better. You can go for a walk after her nap. Mr. George is the father, I understand. Where is the mother? On a business trip? Another demanding job? Ah, if only, Mrs. Eleanor sighed. Our Helen, she's gone. The birth was complicated. The doctors saved the baby but didn't notice the mother needed help. And she herself, Helen, didn't complain. She was worried about the baby. See how it turned out. The day after giving birth, her temperature rose. Examination, intensive care. While they were figuring things out, her heart stopped. Internal bleeding. A rare case. And Sophie was also in intensive care. Born prematurely. A difficult time. How sad. Terribly sad, Mrs. Eleanor agreed. Let me tell you the whole story. You'll likely be here for a while. You should be in the know. George grew up in a prosperous, complete family, loving parents, caring grandparents, his own room, the sea every summer, birthdays, friends, a happy childhood, a happy youth. He graduated from school with a gold medal, thanks in large part to his parents hiring the best tutors. He learned English in foreign camps, vacation, and education. The trips cost an unimaginable amount, hard to get, but for their beloved, long-awaited son. George's parents were older. They hadn't been able to have a child for many years. They had resigned themselves, but then, when hope was gone, life threw them a surprise. It gave them an heir. Needless to say, George wasn't ashamed of his parents. Yes, he saw they were older than his classmates' parents, but he was proud. His father was a well-known businessman. His mother was the chief physician of the regional hospital. Everyone knew and respected them. It never occurred to George to be ashamed of his family. George grew up, his parents grew older. When the young man was in his 3rd year, his father passed away. A stroke, intensive care, coma. George felt like an adult for the first time. He had to delve into the affairs of the firm left to him as an inheritance. He had been interested since adolescence, knew a lot, had the right to sign documents, and yet, for the first time, he entrusted most of it to the manager, his father's friend, because he needed to study and support his mother, who had declined after her husband's death. 3 years passed. George had just received his diploma, taken the helm of the company, and was starting to gain strength. Another blow. His mother. The young man was left alone. He felt unhappy, lonely in the big house. It was good that Mrs. Eleanor, the housekeeper, and almost a member of the family, was nearby. She had known George as a baby, treated him like a son. She had no children of her own. She gave all her care to the inconsolable young man. Work pulled him through then. He had to make decisions, travel, hold meetings, sign contracts. This saved Georgie. Time passed. George transformed from a young man into an intelligent, shrewd man, a talented businessman. Mrs. Eleanor rejoiced. He had matured, grown stronger, gained confidence. She wished he would find a good wife, get married, become a father. Then Mrs. Eleanor's heart would be at peace. Only he didn't have anyone, Mrs. Eleanor said. Girls flocked around him, handsome, wealthy, in demand, but he would meet one, then another. It wasn't right. I could see they weren't for him, and I didn't like them either. It seemed they only wanted money, flirts. And then Helen appeared. George met Helen literally on the street. She was walking, rushing. As it turned out later, to an interview at George's firm, Helen had been laid off. The factory where she worked as an accountant had closed. She was looking for a new job. George went out for a walk to clear his head. His goal was to buy donuts. And then fate brought them face to face. Literally. Helen ran out from around a corner and bumped into George. What followed was like a music video. Her bag flew off, its contents scattered. George and Helen rushed to pick them up. The girl stammered apologies. George assured her it was fine and admired her gray eyes. Love at first sight. Having sorted out the bag, they looked up, smiled. George made the first move. He learned her name, introduced himself. They walked slowly, talking, getting acquainted. Upon learning that Helen was rushing to his office, George beamed. He understood. This beautiful girl was his destiny. It wasn't a coincidence they met like this, not at the office. It was more romantic. Mrs. Eleanor had never seen George so happy. Helen turned out to be intelligent, understanding, kind. She quickly found common ground with Mrs. Eleanor, a sweet, sweet girl. And why did she have such a fate? Mrs. Eleanor lamented. They got married a couple of years later. A wonderful couple, harmonious, happy. Love, understanding, respect. Mrs. Eleanor's heart rejoiced seeing them, her beloved Georgie and his wonderful wife. They decided not to rush with children, Mrs. Eleanor continued, a mutual decision, as if they had a premonition. They traveled, worked, met with friends, and I, foolishly, in my old-fashioned way, advised them not to delay. I wanted a child. George and Helen lived for themselves for 5 years after the wedding. They were happy together. They wanted children, but later. Everything suited them for now. And then the news of Helen's pregnancy, unplanned, but everyone in the household was happy. "Well, it's time," George concluded. "Thank God," Mrs. Eleanor exclaimed, throwing up her hands. "It'll be a boy, I think. You're too beautiful, Helen. Girls take their beauty from their mothers." But the housekeeper was mistaken. The ultrasound showed a girl, healthy, strong. They showed me her photos. They take photos of newborns. I looked. She was the spitting image of Helen. That's how our Sophie was born, looking like her mommy. Sophie, Helen chose the name. George and Mrs. Eleanor didn't object. They liked it. The pregnancy wasn't easy. Toxemia, then high blood pressure, swelling. The baby developed well, but the mother, she suffered, she wasted away, refused to eat, lay in bed a lot. Energetic, Helen didn't have the strength to come downstairs. Mrs. Eleanor brought food to the bedroom. She felt sorry for Helen, helped her, assured her everything would pass after the birth. "Children don't come easily," Mrs. Eleanor sighed. "The pregnancy exhausted her. Remember your sister? Children came easier for her." Helen's labor began much earlier than expected. There was a threat throughout the pregnancy, so she was in the hospital. Doctors tried to stop it, but it didn't work. Sophie was born. She didn't cry. They didn't put her on her mother's chest. When it comes to premature babies, everything is different. Sophie was immediately taken to intensive care, a fight for life. And Helen? At first, everything was fine. Tired, worried about her daughter, naturally. Doctors examined her, found no abnormalities, sent her to a ward. Then symptoms appeared, but it was too late. George and I were worried about the girl. Mrs. Eleanor was on the verge of tears. It was hard to remember. We thought she wouldn't survive. She was so weak. Then in the morning, George got a call from the hospital. His wife had died from internal bleeding. He didn't believe it. He thought they were talking about Sophie. His mind refused to accept it. But no. Sophie pulled through. She was strong. But Helen, she was gone. And with him, she was gone from him. I thought he would. But he recovered. He had to work to help Sophie pull through. Although at first he treated his daughter poorly. He blamed her for what happened to Helen. He knew it was wrong, but he couldn't help it. He was angry. Sophie was discharged. They hired a nanny, but she couldn't cope with an infant. Mrs. Eleanor was old, but she gladly played, pushed her in the stroller, talked to her, and she was the only one who gave the newborn the necessary love. Her father couldn't at that time. "She's like a granddaughter to me," the housekeeper smiled. I accepted her right away. And George. It took him a long time to warm up. He bought everything necessary, sometimes went for walks if I made him. He didn't show initiative himself. And then Sophie got sick. High fever, nothing helped. She was throwing up. The flu was going around, tormenting many. Little ones had a hard time with it. Sophie was in the hospital again. Doctors gave no prognosis. And then George came to his senses. He dropped everything, sat by her bed for days on end. He sang songs, told stories, rocked her. And Sophie. She felt the care, started getting better. She was discharged, and George became different. A real father, a loving one. Life went on. George worked, found time for his daughter. Sophie grew, delighted them with her health, her intelligence. Everything was fine. Only Mrs. Eleanor worried that George was alone. It seemed he wouldn't find happiness until he met a woman. It was difficult now. The chosen one had to love and accept Sophie. There was no other way. "God heard my prayers," Mrs. Eleanor smiled. "George met Larissa, a beauty. You couldn't take your eyes off her. Smart. She has a daughter herself, a little younger than Sophie. They made a wonderful family. Larissa got a job at George's company, and it all started at a corporate event. A common story. Larissa treated Sophie well. She took her and her own daughter to the park, to the cinema. Sophie loved Larissa and her stepsister, Alina. She was happy. George and Larissa got married, started living together. And then Sophie started having symptoms. Dizziness, nausea, weakness, lack of appetite. Examinations at the best clinics, trips abroad, consultations with professors, no results. They couldn't make a diagnosis. The girl was fading away. The first year was still okay. She was on her feet. Mrs. Eleanor was on the verge of tears again. Her heart ached. But after New Year, she was completely bedridden. She's not well. It's terrifying. It's unclear what kind of illness it is. Larissa and her daughter temporarily moved back to her apartment. Alina went to kindergarten, brought home infections, dangerous for Sophie. So they decided. Larissa visits often, almost every day, good for her. She checks on Sophie. She brings Alina when she's healthy. Ever since she started kindergarten, it's been one sick leave after another. So that's how it is. The wife with one child separately, the husband with his older daughter separately. That kind of family. What can you do? It's the situation. A strange situation, Julia said. The story of George and Sophie had shaken her. You could make a TV series about it. It is what it is, Mrs. Eleanor shrugged. You and Sophie got along, I see. That's good. It will be more pleasant for her with you. The days flowed by. Julia lived in a room next to the children's room, but Sophie often asked her to stay the night. Sophie had a comfortable small sofa. Julia made her bed on it. They talked before sleep, held hands. Julia saw this was important to Sophie. The girl lacked attention despite the adults around her. George was a caring, anxious father and pleasant to talk to. They often discussed Sophie. He listened attentively, didn't interrupt, asked the right questions. Julia met Larissa, yes, a beautiful woman. Sculpted cheekbones, curved lips, grace. A queen. But when Larissa interacted with Sophie, straightened her blanket, smiled, stroked her, Julia couldn't shake off the feeling of falseness. In insignificant details, the cold glint in her eyes, a strained smile, something elusive, unpleasant. One day, Julia had a strange dream. She found herself in a room, peeling wallpaper, creaking floors. She sat on a stool by a dark window. Nothing was visible. She knew she was sleeping. She wanted to wake up. But then, from where? Helen appeared. Julia recognized her. She had seen her in photos. Helen smiled sadly, looked with a warm, gentle gaze. Keep an eye on her, she whispered in a voice like the ringing of distant bells. Keep an eye on Larissa. All the troubles come from her. She brings misfortune. Having said this, she dissolved. And Julia wanted to ask, how to keep an eye on her? Why? How was she dangerous? Julia woke up in a cold sweat, as if she had flown back into her body, a strange feeling. Helen's words in her head. No, Julia didn't believe in the supernatural, but the dream? It wasn't much like a dream, more like a journey. The strange dream wouldn't let go. Larissa wasn't there the next day, but Julia was waiting. She knew for sure this woman was involved in something bad. Larissa was harming the family. She didn't love Sophie. She didn't sympathize. She pretended. How could the others not notice? Even experienced Mrs. Eleanor. Larissa appeared the next day. Beautiful, brightly made up, languid. The first thing she did was go to Sophie to say hello, then to the kitchen. Sophie wants something to drink, Larissa said to Mrs. Eleanor. I'll make her some cocoa. Let me, Mrs. Eleanor bustled. No, I can manage. I want to make it for her. You're so caring. Julia remained silent. She watched Larissa as Helen had asked in her dream. It seemed this was the important moment, as if Helen was nearby, prompting her to be vigilant. Mrs. Eleanor was busy with dough. Julia pretended to look out the window, but she watched Larissa. And then, the woman skillfully pulled a small vial from her sleeve, dripped a few drops into the milk, and hid it. A couple of seconds, quick movements. But Julia saw everything. The drink for the princess is ready. Larissa smiled. Julia, hand me her favorite cup. Julia obeyed. She took Sophie's cup with cartoon characters. She understood. Sophie must not drink this. She must not. She had to act. Julia pretended to slip. She bumped into Larissa, who dropped the cup. The cup fell, shattered. The cocoa spilled. I'm sorry. How clumsy of me. Julia bustled, grabbed a rag, wiping up the puddle, picking up the shards. It's nothing. I'll make another one. In Larissa's voice, hidden irritation. Julia couldn't have acted differently. It would have aroused suspicion. She had to accept that Sophie would get cocoa from her stepmother. While Larissa and Mrs. Eleanor were with Sophie, Julia squeezed the rag into a clean jar. She needed to know what Larissa had put in. Maybe vitamins? Then the panic was pointless, but something told her it wasn't that. They waited 2 days for the test results. Seeing the report, Julia was horrified. There was poison in the drink, deadly. The symptoms of poisoning matched those Sophie had. So, the weakness was from her stepmother poisoning her, like in a terrible fairy tale. Julia didn't know who to turn to. Mrs. Eleanor? What could she do? George? He wouldn't believe her. What to do? Larissa couldn't be allowed near the girl. She wanted to send her to the next world. She had almost succeeded. And yet, Julia, gathering her courage, talked to George. She told him everything, the dream, the cocoa, the analysis. She was afraid he would yell at her, kick her out, accuse her. You know, George said, looking at Julia, I would probably have fired you immediately. It's strange, you must admit. But just yesterday, I also had an unusual dream. Helen, she asked me to trust you. Just trust. Nothing more. For now, let's not tell anyone. Take some time off. I need to figure things out. Mrs. Eleanor will call you when you can come back to work. Julia spent those days on pins and needles. She didn't know what was happening. She was worried about Sophie, whom she had grown attached to, but George said to wait. She waited. Mrs. Eleanor called. Julia, seeing the name, felt anxious. What would they say? How had everything gone? Come, was all Mrs. Eleanor said. Come quickly. Sophie misses you. Julia didn't need persuading. Half an hour later, she was at George's house. The master himself opened the door, calm, composed. By his appearance, you couldn't tell what had happened. I want to thank you, the man finally smiled. You were right. Larissa? She really wanted to. It's terrible to say. That wretch wanted to poison Sophie. Imagine that. Mrs. Eleanor didn't stand on ceremony, and I trusted her so much. The story turned out to be mundane. Greedy Larissa couldn't tolerate a rival in the form of her husband's daughter. She wanted her own daughter, Alina, to be the sole heir, or perhaps herself first. Larissa had studied pharmacy but didn't work, living off admirers. Nature had endowed her with beauty. She had opportunities. She had enough knowledge to devise a way to send her hated stepdaughter to the next world. The poison. It was difficult to detect in the blood. Larissa had been adding the toxic substance to Sophie's food. The girl grew weaker, faded away. She was close to her goal. It's unbelievable, unfathomable. Mrs. Eleanor couldn't calm down. Julia understood. Larissa's act was monstrous. How could she do that to a defenseless child? Sophie trusted her, loved her. George installed cameras in the kitchen. It turned out Larissa added poison to the food every time. Sometimes she cooked herself, sometimes she was cunning. She added it to Mrs. Eleanor's cooking. I carried the poison to Sophie with my own hands. Mrs. Eleanor was close to tears again. Larissa was caught red-handed. She was under investigation. Alina was taken by her father, who had long wanted to be involved but wasn't allowed. He was too poor. Alina will be fine, Mrs. Eleanor assured. The child is not to blame. And Sophie, how is she? And Sophie is wonderful, a clear voice rang out from behind. Julia turned around and met Sophie's eyes. Still thin, pale, but already strong enough to walk around the house. A miracle. The doctor said she would recover quickly. Julia and Simon walked slowly along the display windows of a children's store. The girls' section, a kingdom of pink and purple. Dolls, cosmetics, toys. Her eyes darted everywhere. In the US, a guy bought his nephew a voice-controlled robot. It's amazing. Maybe Sophie would like it. She's a girl, Julia reminded him. She definitely wants a doll, a cartoon character. We need to find one. Maybe for her next birthday, she won't want toys anymore. Children grow up fast. Amazing. We'll see for ourselves soon. Simon placed his hand on Julia's rounded belly. The baby responded with a weak but noticeable kick. And that other job? She still needed a job. And Julia had grown used to everyone. Sophie, Mrs. Eleanor, even Mr. George. She didn't want to leave. The adults decided not to tell Sophie the truth. It was too scary. But the clever girl put two and two together. She overheard something, figured something out. The story didn't break her, as they had feared. Sophie took it calmly. Like in fairy tales, she shrugged. The little girl was returning to life. In September, she started school with her peers. And Julia? She re-enrolled at the university. She chose distance learning. She needed to study and work. However, her work now felt more like living in a family. With loved ones, sweet Sophie, kind Mrs. Eleanor, busy but attentive Mr. George. With them, Julia felt cozy, warm. They had accepted her, were grateful for saving Sophie. It was scary to think what would have happened without that strange dream. They discussed that event, first with George, then with Mrs. Eleanor. Mrs. Eleanor was convinced Helen had broken through time to save her daughter. George shook his head, didn't voice an opinion. And Julia? She didn't know what to think. Perhaps Larissa had immediately aroused suspicion. But the dream? George also dreamed of Helen, and she asked him to trust Julia. That was harder to explain. That day, Julia left the house alone. Sophie was doing her homework, Mrs. Eleanor was busy, Julia needed to go to the university, submit documents, and then Simon stepped towards her. Julia couldn't believe her eyes. She recoiled. He looked at her as if no one else mattered. "I finally found you," he said and pulled her close. Julia didn't understand anything, but she didn't resist. She clung to her beloved, savored the closeness, tried not to think about the betrayal, the disappearance. The explanation was ridiculously simple. Simon dropped his phone in the ocean during a boat trip. The gadget was gone forever. Julia wasn't on social media. He couldn't contact her. He wrote letters, sent telegrams. But Julia, she had moved in with George, barely came home. The letters piled up. When she returned, she saw the mailbox door was broken. Someone had opened it, taken the letters. Children? A neighbor? Julia received no news, which is why she decided he had forgotten, started a new life, betrayed her. I couldn't abandon everything. It concerned my career and our future, our well-being. It was unbearable without you, without news. But I knew I had to wait. Then I would be financially secure. I could fly back, explain everything. I had no idea what your situation was. I didn't know about the loan, about being fired, how hard it must have been for you. It was that simple, an unfortunate series of circumstances. Julia rejoiced. Their feelings were real, there was no betrayal, just a misunderstanding that had been resolved. Simon had a contract with a producer in the capital. He got everything he dreamed of, concerts, tours, the opportunity to bring music to people, and money. He bought an apartment for the two of them. Renovations were in full swing. Julia and Simon got married. They were expecting a child. Julia felt happy, loved. She no longer worked for George. A stronger Sophie didn't need a caregiver, but they all remained friends. And right now, Julia and Simon were choosing a gift for their future baby.